There are World Cup finals that are remembered because of the goals. There are finals remembered because of the penalties, the red cards, the refereeing decisions, or the moments of individual brilliance that change everything in the space of a few seconds. And then there are finals that become unforgettable because, long after the trophy has been lifted and the confetti has disappeared, one question refuses to go away. What really decided the final? Was it Spain's control of the football? Was it Argentina's refusal to surrender? Was it the late dismissal of Enzo Fernandez? Was it the tactical battle between Luis de la Fuente and Lionel Scaloni? Was it the experience of Lionel Messi against the extraordinary youth and energy of a new Spanish generation? Or was the answer much simpler? Perhaps the final was decided by a single cross, a single header, a single movement inside the penalty area, and one substitute arriving at precisely the right moment. On July 19, 2026, Spain and Argentina met in the FIFA World Cup final at New York, New Jersey Stadium, with the entire tournament reduced to one last 90 minutes, or, as it turned out, more than 120. Spain had arrived as one of the most technically dominant teams in the competition. Argentina arrived as the defending champions, carrying the weight of a nation that had already experienced the greatest footballing triumph of its recent history, and now stood one victory away from defending the crown. The stakes were almost impossible to exaggerate. For Spain, this was an opportunity to complete another transformation. The country that had once built its football identity around possession and positional control was now trying to prove that its modern generation could combine technical superiority with physical resilience, tactical flexibility, and the ruthlessness required to survive the final match of the world's biggest tournament. For Argentina, the mission was different. This was about defending history. The Argentine side had already survived a difficult route to the final. According to FIFA's tournament record, Argentina had defeated England 2-1 in the semi-final after falling behind, with Enzo Fernandez and Lautaro Martinez scoring late goals, assisted by Lionel Messi. Spain, meanwhile, had defeated France 2-0 to reach the final. The two nations therefore arrived in New York, New Jersey with very different stories behind them, but exactly the same objective in front of them. And then there was Messi. At 39 years old, Lionel Messi entered the final carrying a historical significance that extended far beyond the match itself. The Argentine captain was no longer the young phenomenon who had first appeared on the World Cup stage. He was now the veteran of multiple generations, the player whose career had become inseparable from debates about greatness, legacy, and football history. But this is where caution becomes important. The final was widely described as potentially marking the end of Messi's World Cup journey, but it should not be presented as a confirmed retirement announcement unless Messi himself has officially said so. What was certain was that, at 39, he stood at a very different stage of his career from Spain's youngest stars. The contrast was impossible to ignore. On one side stood Messi, the veteran who had already conquered the world. On the other was a Spanish generation represented by players such as Lamine Yamal, whose presence symbolized the future of international football. The final, therefore, carried a strange duality. It was about the present, but it also felt like a confrontation between eras. And yet, despite all the emotion surrounding the occasion, the match itself was not immediately transformed into a spectacle of goals. Instead, it became something much more complicated. A tactical struggle, a battle of patience, a contest between a Spanish side that wanted to control the game through the ball and an Argentine team determined not to allow that control to become decisive. Spain's fundamental advantage was clear from the beginning. Their football depended on controlling space and possession, moving the ball repeatedly until the opposition's defensive structure was forced to move with it. Argentina's challenge was therefore not simply to defend. It was to defend without becoming trapped. That distinction would become one of the most important themes of the entire final. When a team faces Spain's possession game, there is a temptation to retreat. But retreating too far can create another problem. The deeper a team defends, the more territory it concedes. The more territory it concedes, the more opportunities the opponent has to recycle possession. And the more the opponent recycles possession, the more exhausting the defensive work becomes. This is why Spain's style can be so difficult to confront. The ball itself becomes a weapon. Spain can make an opponent run without necessarily creating an immediate scoring chance. A midfielder moves the ball sideways. The winger drops deeper. The fullback advances. The center-back steps forward. The opposition shifts. Then the ball moves again. The objective is not always to attack immediately. Sometimes the objective is to make the opponent defend for so long that eventually one player moves half a meter too far. That half meter can become a goal. Argentina understood this danger. Their approach was therefore based on disruption. The intention was to make Spain uncomfortable, to interrupt rhythm, to prevent the Spanish midfield from operating with complete freedom, and to turn the match into a contest of individual duels rather than allowing Spain to dictate everything through collective movement. This was where the physical side of the final became so important. The match contained numerous interruptions and challenges, and the rhythm repeatedly struggled to develop into the kind of free-flowing attacking spectacle that many had expected from two elite football nations. But describing Argentina's approach simply as defensive would be too easy. The deeper question was whether Argentina's defensive strategy was actually working. The answer, at least for long stretches, was yes. Spain controlled the game. But control is not the same thing as victory. Possession is not the same thing as penetration. And territorial dominance is not automatically the same thing as creating clear opportunities. That distinction explains why the final remained goalless through normal time. Spain could have the ball without immediately breaking Argentina apart. Argentina could defend successfully without necessarily creating enough attacking football to win the match. The result was a strange equilibrium. Spain looked like the team in command. Argentina looked like the team waiting for the one moment that might change everything. And whenever a match reaches that kind of balance, the investigation becomes much more interesting. Because now the question is not simply which team played better. The question becomes which team was playing the game it wanted. Spain wanted control. Argentina wanted resistance. For a significant portion of the match, both objectives were being achieved simultaneously. Spain's midfield attempted to establish its authority through Rodri and the players around him. Rodri's role was especially important because his value was not limited to spectacular passes or dramatic attacking moments. His greatest contribution came through positioning. He was the player who helped Spain maintain structure. When Spain attacked, he provided security behind the ball. When possession was lost, he helped organize the immediate response. When Argentina attempted to counter, his positioning became a barrier between the Argentine attack and Spain's defensive line. This is one of the least visible aspects of elite midfield play. The best defensive midfielder is often the player who prevents danger before the audience realizes that danger existed. Argentina, meanwhile, faced a difficult problem. How could they attack without giving Spain the spaces that Spain wanted? If Argentina pushed too many players forward, they risked losing the defensive compactness that had kept the match under control. If they remained too cautious, they risked finishing the final without creating enough chances to win it. That tension shaped the entire game. And it is here that some of the original claims about the match require careful qualification. The supplied summary described Argentina as adopting a highly physical and disruptive defensive approach and suggested that the team focused more on stopping Spain than creating attacking opportunities. There is some truth in the broader description of Argentina struggling to produce attacking threat, but the phrase highly physical should not be interpreted as evidence of an intentional attempt to play outside the laws. The final was competitive and intense, but individual fouls must be judged individually, and there is no basis for turning a tactical description into an accusation of deliberate misconduct. What the match clearly demonstrated was that Argentina struggled to translate their defensive resistance into sustained attacking pressure. That became increasingly significant as the minutes passed. Because Spain's greatest advantage was not necessarily that they could score whenever they wanted. It was that they could continue playing their football. Argentina had to solve the problem. Spain only had to remain patient. And patience can become decisive in a World Cup final. The longer the game stayed level, the more pressure moved toward Argentina. Every defensive clearance created another Spanish attack. Every Spanish possession phase forced Argentina to reset. Every minute without an Argentine breakthrough made the possibility of extra time more likely. And extra time changes football. The legs become heavier. The spaces become larger. The mental pressure becomes enormous. A player who would normally have enough energy to track a run suddenly has to make a decision while exhausted. A defender who would normally communicate clearly becomes slower to react. A midfielder who has spent more than 90 minutes covering space suddenly has to decide whether to press or retreat. The smallest tactical mistake can become the biggest moment in a player's career. That is precisely what happened when the final entered its decisive phase. Enzo Fernandez, one of Argentina's key midfield figures, was sent off late in normal time after receiving a second yellow card. This was a major turning point. Whatever interpretation one has of the individual challenge, the consequence was undeniable. Argentina were now reduced to 10 men. The team that had already spent much of the match defending against Spain's possession would now have to survive extra time while numerically inferior. That changed the tactical mathematics. Spain suddenly had more space. Argentina had fewer players with which to cover it. The Argentine defensive bloc had to become even more disciplined. Every Spanish switch of play became more dangerous. Every movement from the wide areas demanded greater concentration. And Spain had another advantage: the bench. The possibility of introducing fresh legs became increasingly important. This is where Ferran Torres entered the story. He was not the player who had carried the entire final from the opening whistle. He was not the dominant figure throughout the first half. But in a World Cup final, a substitute does not need to dominate 120 minutes. He needs to dominate one moment. That moment came in the 106th minute. The goal itself was the product of a sequence that revealed something about Spain's approach. Pedro Porro delivered the cross. Nico Williams reached it at the far post and headed the ball down. And Ferran Torres, arriving to meet the opportunity, finished first time into the roof of the net. It was the only goal of the final. It was also the goal that transformed Spain's statistical dominance into something tangible. A trophy, a second World Cup title, place in history. FIFA's official match report describes Spain as dominating the game from start to finish, but having to wait until the 106th minute to find the breakthrough. The same report identifies the precise combination: Porro's cross, Williams' header down, and Torres' finish. This detail matters because it changes how the final should be understood. The match was not won by Spain simply because they had possession. They won because, eventually, their control produced the decisive sequence. That is the difference between possession football as a philosophy and possession football as an effective competitive system. The objective is not to keep the ball forever. The objective is to use the ball to create the moment when the opponent can no longer defend everything. Argentina had managed to delay that moment. They had not managed to eliminate it. And after Fernandez's dismissal, the task became even harder. But there is another question. Was Spain genuinely dominant? Or did the statistics exaggerate their superiority? This is where football analysis becomes more complicated. A team can dominate possession and still lose. A team can have more shots and still create fewer genuinely dangerous opportunities. A team can control territory without controlling the emotional rhythm of the match. Argentina's defensive success for long periods demonstrates that Spain's superiority was not absolute. Spain were better at controlling the match. But Argentina were effective at preventing Spain from turning that control into goals. That distinction explains the 0-0 scoreline after 90 minutes. The final therefore became a battle between Spanish patience and Argentine resistance. And eventually resistance broke. The moment Ferran Torres scored, the entire tactical landscape changed again. Argentina were behind. They were already down to 10 men. There was no longer a reason to preserve the defensive structure at all costs. They had to attack. But attacking with 10 players against Spain is a very different problem from defending with 10 players. The Argentine team had to advance. Spain could retreat slightly and protect the advantage. The team that had spent much of the match searching for space suddenly had to defend it. The team that had spent much of the match defending suddenly had to create. And this is one of the cruelest realities of football. A match can be decided by a goal that arrives at exactly the moment when the losing team no longer has enough time, energy, or players to respond. Argentina had survived 90 minutes. They had survived Spain's possession. They had survived the pressure. They had survived the absence of goals. But they could not survive the final 15 minutes after Spain finally found the breakthrough. This is why the timing of Torres' goal was so significant. Had Spain scored earlier, Argentina would have had more time to respond. Had Spain scored before Fernandez was dismissed, Argentina would have had a full complement of players available for the final stages. Had Argentina scored first, Spain would have been forced to take greater risks. Instead, the decisive goal arrived after the match had already entered its most exhausting phase, and after Argentina had been reduced to 10 men. The sequence of events therefore matters. It is not enough to say Spain won because they were better. The evidence suggests a more complicated chain. Spain controlled possession and territory. Argentina successfully resisted for long periods. Argentina failed to generate enough attacking threat. Fernandez's second yellow card left them with 10 men. Spain continued to apply pressure. And in extra time, the combination of Porro, Williams, and Torres finally broke the deadlock. That is the story of the final. But the story did not end with the goal. In fact, it barely ended with the final whistle. Because once the match was over, the emotional pressure that had accumulated for more than 2 hours exploded. The final whistle should have represented closure. Instead, it became another beginning. Reports and social media footage circulated rapidly in the aftermath, with claims of confrontations involving players from both teams. But here again, an investigative account must separate verified events from viral narratives. The supplied summary describes a confrontation involving Leandro Paredes and Eric Garcia, claims that Nicolas Otamendi exchanged heated words with Rodri, and suggests that Rodri demonstrated restraint by walking away. These details should be treated carefully unless supported by clear official footage or disciplinary records. What can be said with confidence is that the atmosphere after the final was tense and that the emotional temperature was extremely high. Argentina had just lost a World Cup final. Spain had just won one. The contrast was absolute. One group was celebrating the greatest achievement of its footballing lives. The other was watching a chance at history disappear. In that environment, confrontations can happen quickly. Players who have spent 120 minutes battling each other are suddenly expected to switch from opponents to sportsmen within seconds. Most do. Sometimes emotions overflow. The responsibility of a documentary is not to exaggerate those moments. It is to understand them, and the broader context matters. Argentina had entered the tournament as defending champions. They had already endured the pressure of being the team everyone wanted to defeat. They had also reached the final after a dramatic semi-final victory over England. Spain, meanwhile, had arrived with their own expectations. They were not simply another finalist. They were a team whose identity had become associated with technical football, possession, and a new generation of players capable of playing at the highest level under enormous pressure. The final, therefore, represented two different models of football history. Argentina were trying to preserve a legacy. Spain were trying to establish one. Messi represented the first. Rodri and the younger Spanish generation represented the second. That contrast was especially powerful because of the age difference between the central figures of the two teams. Messi's World Cup career had become a historical story in itself. Lamine Yamal's story was still being written. The young Spanish star's presence offered a symbolic image of transition, but it is important not to reduce the entire final to a simplistic old versus young narrative. Football does not work that neatly. Experience mattered to Argentina. Youth mattered to Spain. But the result was decided by tactics, execution, discipline, and one decisive sequence. The final also demonstrated why World Cup football can be so unpredictable. Argentina had some of the most technically gifted players in the world. They had Messi. They had experienced defenders. They had midfielders capable of controlling games. They had a goalkeeper with a reputation for performing in major moments. Yet none of those advantages guaranteed victory. Spain's collective structure proved more influential. This is one of the strongest conclusions that can be drawn from the match. The final was not won by one superstar defeating another. It was won by a team maintaining its tactical identity for longer. Argentina's strategy worked for much of the match, but Spain's strategy worked for the entire match. That is an important difference. When Spain failed to score in normal time, they did not abandon their approach. They did not suddenly become frantic. They continued searching. When Argentina were reduced to 10 men, Spain did not simply throw every player forward. They continued to manipulate space. When the decisive opportunity appeared, they took it. This is where the performance of Ferran Torres becomes particularly interesting. A player who enters a final as a substitute can sometimes be psychologically disadvantaged. The starting players have already established the rhythm. The substitute has to enter a game that is already emotionally and physically mature. But Torres did not need to create the entire victory. He needed to finish the opportunity. And he did. In that sense, the goal represented the value of squad depth. World Cup finals are rarely won by 11 players alone. They are won by the entire squad. The player who starts may establish the structure. The player who enters may provide the final piece. The defender who makes one clearance may be as important as the striker who scores. The goalkeeper who makes one save may prevent the entire match from taking a different direction. The midfielder who avoids one dangerous turnover may quietly protect the result. This is why the final cannot be understood only through the goals. The goal is the visible event. The 90 minutes before it are the investigation. Spain's victory also carried historical significance. According to FIFA, the triumph was Spain's second World Cup title. The result also placed the country among the select group of nations with multiple World Cup victories. For Spain, the achievement was therefore about more than one final. It was confirmation that their footballing system could produce another generation capable of winning the world's biggest tournament. The country had already experienced its golden era. Now it had another champion. That is perhaps the most important story behind the result. The football world had spent years asking whether Spain could reproduce the success of its earlier generation. The answer came in New York, New Jersey. Yes, but not in exactly the same way. The earlier Spanish model became famous for prolonged possession and midfield control. The modern version has evolved. The team still values possession, but it also has greater athleticism, greater speed in wide areas, and a willingness to attack space more aggressively. The result is a Spain capable of controlling the ball without becoming completely predictable. Argentina's defensive strategy therefore faced a particularly difficult challenge. They were not defending against a team that only wanted to pass sideways. They were defending against a team that could patiently circulate the ball and then accelerate. That change of rhythm is often what breaks defensive structures. A team can defend against slow possession. A team can defend against direct football. The most difficult opponent is the one capable of moving between the two. Spain could slow the match down, then accelerate, slow down, accelerate again. And when Argentina finally lost a player, that ability became even more dangerous. This brings us back to the most controversial tactical question of the final. Did Argentina's defensive approach go too far? There is no simple answer. A team has every right to defend aggressively within the laws of the game. Physical football is part of the sport. The real question is whether the strategy prevented Argentina from developing their own attack. And the evidence suggests that this was the greater problem. Argentina's defensive work may have helped keep the score level, but it came at a cost. Every player focused primarily on stopping Spain is a player who is not attacking Spain. Every minute spent defending is a minute in which Argentina are not creating. The strategy therefore created a paradox. Argentina's success in preventing Spain from scoring also contributed to their inability to create a rhythm of their own. That does not mean the strategy was wrong. It means the strategy had a ceiling, could keep Argentina alive, could not necessarily win them the match. And once Fernandez was sent off, that ceiling became lower. The dismissal is therefore one of the defining moments of the final. Without the red card, perhaps Argentina would have defended extra time with 11 players. Perhaps they would have created a counterattack. Perhaps Spain would have become more cautious. Perhaps the match would have gone to penalties. But those possibilities belong to the realm of counterfactual history. What we know is what happened. Fernandez was dismissed. Spain had a numerical advantage. Torres scored. Argentina lost. The rest is speculation. This is where responsible sports journalism must resist the temptation to rewrite history. Football fans naturally ask, what if? What if the red card had not happened? What if Argentina had attacked earlier? What if Spain had scored in the first half? What if Argentina had taken more risks? What if the match had gone to penalties? Those questions are fascinating, but they cannot change the evidence. The evidence says Spain were the better team in control. The evidence says Argentina were competitive defensively. The evidence says Argentina struggled to create sufficient attacking threat. The evidence says Fernandez's dismissal changed the final. And the evidence says Ferran Torres' goal decided it. Everything beyond that must be treated as interpretation. That distinction becomes even more important when examining the claims surrounding the post-match confrontation. The internet has a tendency to turn a tense moment into a definitive narrative within minutes. A clip appears. Player is identified. A confrontation is described. A motive is assigned. A story is created. But football documentaries should not operate like social media. They should ask what the footage actually proves. If two players are seen arguing, that proves an argument. It does not automatically prove who started it. If a player gestures angrily, that proves emotion. It does not prove intent. If teammates move toward a confrontation, that proves tension. It does not necessarily prove that everyone involved was physically fighting. The same principle applies to claims about Rodri. If the Spanish captain was seen walking away from a heated exchange, that may reasonably be interpreted as restraint. But interpreting it as a definitive act of heroism requires more context. What matters most is the broader picture. Spain won the final. Argentina